This is Foresight, written by W.J. May, narrated by Zach Smith. Chapter 1. What are you reading? Kiera startled and closed her book, glancing up with a forced smile as Jessie strode back down the path. They were in a brief respite of a never-ending hike, a moment of unexpected calm, as the immortal members of their party scouted further ahead for the best route through the forest. "It's nothing," she said quickly, tucking her hair behind her ears. "A poem written about a fae and a vampire. Kind of heartbreaking stuff, really. Kind of striking too close to home." His face brightened with a teasing smile. "There is poetry about such things?" he quipped, tossing an apple into her hands and taking a bite of another. "Nothing too lyrical, I hope. I'd imagine it to be more of a limerick. There once was a fae from Audible who gathered his friends by a well. A vampire walked by, they took out their knives and sent that fool straight back to..." There was a rustling of leaves as both immortals appeared in the clearing. They had come from separate directions, having wandered down opposite sides of the wooded slope, but arrived back at precisely the same time. Evander's eyes went as always for Eden, while the fae greeted his companions with a sparkling smile. "What are you speaking about?" he asked brightly. "I could have sworn I heard a rhyme." They froze for a moment, then Kiera slid the book into her pack. Nothing. Upon leaving the hollow just a few days before, the journey facing the friends had been wildly uncertain. While they had already travelled a perilous road searching for answers, there was always meant to be an end to it. A collection of more people with more weapons and more strength to add to their own. There was always meant to be a solution, a well-earned finish to their precarious isolation as they folded themselves into the waves of others flooding to their cause. That had been the intent, but their saviour had provided nothing but riddles and vague promises of despair. You cannot kill a dragon. You need a dragon to kill a dragon. Many times as the sun beat down on her shoulders, Kiera had remembered Marrow's easy smiles with a pang of true hatred, pressing her lips together and grinding her teeth. It was death he offered, nothing more. The only reason they were still trudging through the forest, still heading towards the grisly unknown, was that someone needed to do it. And despite being rather wickedly removed from the situation, the fates had provided the smallest glimmer of hope. Or maybe the fates had nothing to do with it. Maybe it was the sheer will of a fae. "Come on, tell me," Eden insisted, stealing the shifter's apple and taking a large bite for himself. "I always include the pair of you in my own compositions." "And I wish you wouldn't," Jessie replied crossly, swiping for it. "As I've said many times." When he missed the first time, he tried a second. When Eden held it out of reach, eyeing him with a devilish grin, he vaulted off a nearby poplar and attacked the fae from behind. Kiera watched their antics with a faint smile. There had been no hiding the fae's excitement since they'd left the hollow. Unlike the rest of his companions, who tread carefully and glanced over their shoulders with every step, the man acted as though he'd been unleashed, bounding from one place to another, casting those sparkling eyes to the horizon and lifting the other spirits with every liberated breath. It was nothing strange to him, chasing after monsters with nothing but the sun on his cheeks and the bow on his back. He dreamt of nothing else since he was just a boy. "Were you able to find anything?" Evander finally prompted, arms folded across his chest. He, too, had been watching the shifter and the fae attack each other, but held back with his usual reserve. There had scarcely been a moment since they'd left the hollow where he hadn't been watching the fae, always with the same silent worry, always with his eyes flickering to the clouds. The only solace he seemed to find was his personal invitation to join the fellowship. "Sorry?" Eden detached himself with a tousled grin, still clinging to the stolen apple. Fresh blood had been drawn, and the poplar had not survived the assault, but the fruit remained in his hands. The vampire stole a lingering glance before pursing his lips and trying again. "Did you find a better way down the mountain?" "Oh, right." The Fae tossed him the apple. "Yes, there's a decent path that winds along the ravine we spotted earlier. There's a stream that transects one part, but it's shallow enough to easily cross. We could reach it in a few days." Evander stared a moment longer before looking into his hands. "Why did you give me this?" Eden's lips curved in a sly smile. "Because then I win." Kiera cast a glance between them before letting out a snort of laughter. It was an unlucky fool who had dared to retrieve their prize from the hands of a vampire. From the varied looks on the faces around her, the others were coming to realize this as well. Jessie backed away with a sullen glare, while Evander froze in shock. He continued staring at the fruit, then lifted his eyes to where the Fae was patching a hole they discovered in the tent, whistling ancient victory tunes under his breath. There were many sides to such a creature, and he was coming to learn them all. The cheerful warrior, the restless dreamer, the immortal guardian, determined to embrace the potential of each new day. But this new version, this mischievous prankster, the vampire was all the more besotted by him. He hesitated a moment, then joined him silently by the tent. Without seeming to think about it, he picked up the thread the Fae had been holding, pulling the canvas taut. Without seeming to think about it, the Fae made a space, knotting the other side. "I wanted to thank you," he said softly. Eden glanced up in surprise. "For what?" The vampire kept his eyes on the tent. "For what you said back at the hollow, that you wished for me to come along." His fingers stilled and his cheeks burned in the fading light. "I wish to stay, for however long you will have me." A quiet hush fell over the campsite as their eyes met across the tent. A strange series of emotions passed across the Fae's face, too quickly to make any sense of them. They rose and fell one after another, like waves cresting upon a tide. In the end, he was simply blank. "I'm glad to hear it. We could use the help." He paced into the twilight without another word, pausing only to give Evander a friendly clap on the arm. It was for the best that he was facing, as always, towards the horizon. He never had to see the look on the vampire's face. It felt good to be getting back to normal. A suicidal mission with astronomical odds, a simple stew beside a crackling campfire. Only there was nothing normal about it. That night, something special had transpired. 7 hells! Jessie stepped out from the curtain of trees, a sprig of freshly picked rosemary in his hands. "Did you actually cook something edible?" Kiera flashed him a withering look, but couldn't in good conscience disagree. The friends had spent many tenuous nights chewing what she'd claimed to be root vegetables. While the Fae made his opinion well known, the shifter had never offered a word of complaint. "It's my own creation," she answered daintily, staring around in the bubbling cauldron. "The working title is Kiera's Wilderness Chowder, but I'm open to other suggestions." He came up behind her, pressing a kiss to her cheek. "Seriously, that smells amazing. And here I was going to smother it in this." He gave the rosemary a twirl before tossing it over his shoulder. "I'll find us some bowls." The packs were already inside the tent, but he found the correct one quickly, rifling around inside for a brief moment before returning with everything they might need. "You're just hungry," Evander said quietly, watching from the other side of the fire. He hadn't spoken much since the Fae's casual dismissal, but he was watching the same as always, those dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "We were in that man's house for 3 days." The stew was instantly forgotten, as the others turned to him in shock. 3 days? Kiera repeated in bewilderment. "What are you talking about?" The vampire lifted his shoulders in a shrug. "Time seems to move differently in such places. I thought you knew." 7 hells! In a flash, Her mind replayed every second, trying to understand how it could have happened, trying to reconcile the shift. It had been afternoon when they arrived, and afternoon when they left. They could see the sun outside the window each moment, and yet... Eden tilted his head curiously, catching his gaze across the fire. "How did you know?" Not for a moment did he question it was true. Despite whatever troubling undercurrents might plague them, he trusted the vampire implicitly, in a way he didn't even trust his own friends. "Must be an immortal thing." Evander shrugged again, though for the first time he seemed reluctant to meet the Fae's gaze. "I felt it when we left, saw the shifting of the moon that night. Could you not sense it?" The Fae shook his head in silence, wondering why that might be. 3 days, Kiera muttered indignantly, feeling strangely offended to have been robbed of the time. "Thank the gods we didn't stay for beats." Jessie settled down beside her, placing a bowl in her hands. "Since we're finally speaking of the Hollow," he began slowly, throwing the others a cautious glance, "I have a question about Marrow." Kiera nodded knowingly. "Why so tall?" "All right, 2 questions." Eden rolled his eyes. "What is it, Jess?" Perhaps the Fae was hoping for some valid curiosity, an enlightened insight that would lead to a thoughtful conversation, that might in turn lead to something else. But if that was what he'd been expecting, he was sadly mistaken, because the shifter had his mind on something else. "Evander, would you fight him?" Kiera let out a breath of laughter, while the vampire glanced up in surprise. Eden stretched out his legs with an exasperated grin, though he seemed genuinely curious to know the answer. "Would I fight him?" the vampire repeated slowly. He weighed the question a moment before his eyes suddenly cooled. "I am not your gauge for all things dangerous." Jessie flashed a mischievous grin, while Kiera answered apologetically. "You kind of are." "Let him be," Eden instructed. "I'm just asking." "I would never wish to fight him," Evander interrupted, stopping the conversation in its tracks. "He is different. It would never cross my mind." It was quiet for a moment, as all 4 of them considered this, staring into the crackling flames and replaying the fateful encounter in their minds. To be perfectly honest, they'd all taken great pains not to think about Marrow since leaving the cottage. The business with the dragon was unsettling enough, as was his casual instruction to consult the dead. But it was those moments immediately after, when he'd taken each of them aside in turn. Those were the moments that lingered, festering like a burn. The fire crackled in between them, popping and hissing as the logs glowed with heat. 3 spoons scraped quietly against bowls, 4 people silently asking themselves the same questions. Then Jessie lifted his eyes. "But if you had to fight, eat your soup." A spattering of laughter broke the tension, as the friends settled back once again, content to leave those troublesome queries for another day. The bowls were refilled, as the cauldron was quickly emptied. The vampire was right. Their bodies were still playing catch-up. They just hadn't known why. "You're not even tempted?" Kiera asked with a smile, wafting it towards him. He turned his head stiffly, taking in a breath of clean air. "I can't begin to tell you how much I'm not tempted." "Don't take it personally, love." Jessie pushed to his feet with a grin, stretching his arms above his head. "It's one of your best. I couldn't find a single bone in mine." Kiera started to smile, then flashed him a quick look. "Love?" Since the night of their fateful reading lesson, a great many affections and endearments had slipped into their vocabulary, but that one was quite different. That one was new. That's good. About the bones, I mean." Eden's eyes drifted between them. Evander couldn't physically have cared less. The only one who remained oblivious was the shifter himself. He yawned widely, then headed for the tent. "I vote the Fae keeps first watch. seeing as this disaster was his idea and all of us will likely be killed for it. The rest of us should savor the memories and dream while we still can." "Charming." He flashed a sweet smile and offered Kiera his hand. "We'll see you in the morning." Eden nodded indulgently as the two headed to bed, too openly excited to take offense. He, too, had been contemplating what he now considered a rather fortuitous turn of events. It took him a moment to notice the one person who made no attempt to go inside. "Why don't I just take the watch?" Evander asked quietly. "I'll be here anyway." The Fae's eyes flashed up as the others paused by the door. "No, that's—" But it was too late. The vampire was already gone. Needless to say, it wasn't the easiest of nights. The silent argument was already brewing as the three companions settled down to sleep as they always did. Though it came as no surprise, not everyone was on the same side. "Are we really going to keep doing this?" Kiera demanded as soon as the others had laid down, folding her arms tight across her chest. "Making him sleep outside like some kind of animal?" It had bothered her the first night after the Hollow. She'd almost been moved to speak in the 2 nights since, but for whatever reason, that evening had proven the final straw. "We slept together on the boat," she reminded them before anyone could answer. "Nothing happened. Nothing even started to happen. We're trusting him with our safety right now, making him keep watch, but we still won't let him sleep with us in the tent." The men shared a look, neither wanting to speak first. "There isn't any room," Jessie began tentatively. "After he saved us from those monsters," she interrupted frankly. "After he saved me from the river. After he volunteered to journey into the unknown and help us find the dragon. After all of that, you're still going to make him sleep outside." "He can hear you," Jessie mouthed, pointing to his ear. She let out a frustrated sigh. "Eden, back me up." The Fae pointed to his ear as well. He simply used a different finger. While he'd asked himself the same question many times, considering whether he should sleep outside in a show of solidarity, he didn't appreciate others asking it now. The same way a part of him had been strangely anxious when Jessie had given his approval to allow the vampire to travel alongside them. The same way all words had failed him when they were standing by the fire. "You would truly feel comfortable?" Jessie asked quietly, looking at her in surprise. He'd been right about there not being any room. The three friends were pressed against one another as it was. "You would truly be able to sleep with him so close?" "Probably not." "Of course I would," she answered stiffly. "And I want you both to consider it. It's not fair that we ask him to take the same risks without offering the same comfort in return." Jessie regarded her a moment, before softening with a faint smile. "The same comfort, huh?" His eyes flickered ever so briefly to Eden. "If that's the way you feel, I'd be willing to consider it. I'm just not sure how comfortable we all wish him to be." The Fae said nothing in reply. He merely rolled over and pretended to sleep. As it turned out, Kiera wasn't able to sleep that night anyway. She tossed and turned for a while, unable to get comfortable, before finally opening her eyes and staring around the tent. It was after midnight, and Eden was already on watch, prowling in the darkness somewhere with a bow at his side. But Jessie was still nestled right up against her. One arm was flung around her waist, and his dark hair spilled across their shared blanket, fluttering with each shallow breath. She smiled in spite of herself, staring from just inches away. Love. It was probably unintentional. It was probably just a pet name. If she racked her brain, she could probably remember a time that Eden had said the same thing. So why did it feel so different? Why did she remember the exact tone of his voice? Why did she keep playing it back in her mind? She lifted the tip of her finger, tracing it along his lips. It wasn't the easiest time to be thinking about such things, and yet there was something quite natural about it as well. Something that defied their circumstance and made her think about only the good things, as if the mere sight of him made all the rest of the world simply fade away. Perhaps it was merely their unsteady position. For the last few months, they'd been roaming the wilderness with nowhere to lean except on each other. Or perhaps it was something different. Perhaps it was that he was exactly the person she would have chosen for herself. With a surge of mischief, she leaned a little closer, wondering if he'd wake up with a soft kiss. Then a sudden pain shot down her leg, and she reached between them, digging into her pocket. Her hand came up with a stone. It looked as lovely then as it had hanging in Marrow's window, that clear blue somehow untouched by the shadows of night. She rolled onto her back, holding it thoughtfully above her head. There hadn't been a moment since they'd left when she hadn't been touching it. Her fingers found it with each passing step, with each mountain trail, turning it absent-mindedly in her cloak. Why did he give it to me? She wondered, examining it anew. Why did he have it in the first place? A sudden wave of restlessness swept over her, and before she stopped to consider what she was doing, she eased free of Jessie's arm and slipped quietly outside the tent. The moon was still hanging overhead, but its light was already fading, brightening into the soft pinks and brimming golds of a new dawn. She paused at the remains of the fire, nothing more than smouldering embers, and saw Evander wrapped in a blanket just a few paces beyond. His eyes were closed, and that lovely face was completely relaxed, making him look younger than she'd seen. So vampires do sleep. She smiled to herself, wandering away from the camp and into the trees. Such a thing usually wasn't permitted, but those rules had eased somewhat with the addition of a vampire. A great many things had eased. Strange, given the tension of his arrival. The ferns parted with a quiet rustle as she waded through the middle, rubbing the stone absent-mindedly in her pocket as she considered the poem she'd read earlier. Was Jessie right? Was there an inevitable conclusion to such a thing? Or were the forces that had brought them together greater than the ones that threatened to tear them apart? There are exceptions to every rule. Why not something like this? She chewed pensively on her lips, breathing in the clean night air. Why couldn't a fae make peace with a... Something hard smacked into her face, and she came to an abrupt stop, rubbing painfully at her nose and lifting her eyes to see what she'd run into. They kept lifting and kept lifting, until finally they reached the top. 7 hells! She swallowed hard as the stone went limp in her hand. This is why we don't wander after dark. Chapter 2. Eden? Kiera froze where she was standing, gazing upwards like a silver-lit sapling, trembling in the breeze. Her arms and legs had gone numb the second her eyes made sense of what was happening. A second after that, her brain presented a muddled assessment. That is a cave troll. She couldn't tell you how she knew it for certain. The only point of reference she had were the poorly drawn illustrations from her childhood books. No one really knew what a cave troll looked like, because no one who'd ever encountered one had survived to bring back the tale. They were so far down on the list of peripheral possibilities, it almost failed to register, as if when her eyes swept the forest, they didn't see the hulking giant, but a blank space where it stood. She whispered again into the forest, her voice lost in the shadows. Eden! In hindsight, she probably should have called for the vampire. Not only were his senses unparalleled, but he was sleeping outside the tent. Jessie was another logical option, given that he could change into a lupine predator at the drop of a hat. There were a lot of things she probably should have done in hindsight, but when her lips opened, she found herself calling for the Fae. It was a childish reaction, but this was a monster from every childhood dream, the one that leaped with ready hands from the shadows, the one that could appear perfectly invisible, except for its eyes and its teeth. 2 legs planted in the ground before her, coated in mottled skin and thick, as an evergreen. The most unfortunate seamstress in the realm had constructed some type of loincloth, while the rest of its body seemed to stretch in every direction, bulging with muscles, and curled into an inevitable fist. She couldn't quite make out the top of it. The lines were lost in the skyline, but she took that observation by itself to be quite a terrible sign. That's probably the way everyone feels the moment before they die. She shuddered involuntarily, on the verge of blacking out. The only reason she wasn't dead already was that the creature itself couldn't seem to get over the shock. It was staring at her with a crease down the middle of its forehead, the way wild animals avoided those that had gone mad. Her eyes snapped shut as it leaned closer, leaving the fading warmth of twin tears streaking down at her cheeks. The must of rotten breath washed over her, plastering her hair to her neck. "Eden, please." It must have been nothing more than imagination, but she felt as though she heard him coming, turning his head somewhere else in the forest as her voice drifted through the trees. He stepped into the clearing a moment later, freezing shock white. His lips parted, but there wasn't anything to say. It was standing right there. She was standing right beside it. If she reached out a finger, it would touch that putrid flesh. "How?" "I walked into it," she whispered, breaking the silence. The Fae turned those eyes to her. "You walked into it?" She swallowed a hard lump. "I was playing with my rock." Considering the circumstances, the two shared a very long look. The stalemate had stretched on long enough. The mutual shock was fading. The Fae took a single look at what lay in front of him and decided to make a judgment call. "Evander, can you come here?" His eyes travelled back to the troll. "Quickly." Faster than sight, the vampire was among them, appearing so suddenly it was like he'd manifested from the trees. Oddly enough, he didn't have any trouble spotting the troll. No pesky rocks to distract him. He took an involuntary step back, then froze very still. "Is this a hazing?" It was the last thing Kiera was expecting, and the last thing for which Eden was prepared. He actually tore his eyes from the creature, giving the vampire a fleeting look. "You overestimate my resources." That was when the troll let out a roar. Evander's face paled several degrees, but he stood his ground. One hand reached out, not for Kiera, but for the immortal standing between them. "Step away from it, please." The troll's eyes flew from one to the other, like a falcon jumping between mice. When none of them said it directly, each was struck with the feeling that if ever that gaze was allowed to settle, that person would not survive. "I need to get to Kiera." Eden's voice was as soft as nightingales and strangely calm. Her heart leapt, then faltered at the same time, squeezing out each pulse like the guilt was crushing it alive. She should not have called him. She should not have called any of them. It was her choice to wander away from camp. These were the consequences. The vampire seemed to agree. At any rate, he did not value them the same. He moved forward ever so slightly, like he was considering taking the Fae by force, but whether he was wary of setting off the beast, or merely certain of the Fae's inevitable reaction, he stayed where he was. Those fangs were glinting in the moonlight, pressing into his lip. "What is the plan?" he asked softly, unable to hide the strain. Eden was as calm as ever, gazing up at the creature with the same eternal confidence as when he'd approached the frightened horse. "I'm going to change places and throw her to you." The creature bellowed again, eyes flashing between them. "Change places?" Kiera echoed faintly, unable to even imagine such a thing, much less endorse it. "Eden, you can't." "No, that is a bad plan." But as it turned out, the Fae wasn't offering up his idea for discussion, so much as he was simply announcing it. He took a step forward, eyes on the troll, when Jessie burst through the trees. Unlike the others, there was no delay in translation, and no time lost to shock. The second he saw the beast, his mouth fell open, and he reared back with a loud, "What the hell?" That was when several things happened. The ground quaked below them, a flock of birds exploded from the trees, and a giant hand reached straight for Kiera, flying out of the darkness with an ungodly burst of speed. But someone else reached her first. "Take a breath." There was a chance the Fae was unaware of the image behind him, the monster's gaping jaw, the moonlight reflecting off its teeth. There was a chance he couldn't sense the hand flying towards him, already blowing the strands of his hair. There was a chance, though it certainly wasn't likely, but it never showed on his face. He caught her gaze for a suspended moment, radiating such irresistible calm she found herself forgetting what was happening and thinking it might actually be okay. The night faded to a blur around them, the noise quieted to a hum, and his eyes twinkled with the very hint of a smile. She took a breath. He grabbed her a second later, catching her lightly around the waist and throwing her without hesitation towards Evander. The vampire caught her without looking, almost as an afterthought. His eyes were trained on Eden, wide and fixed with a look of silent dread. She turned around just as the troll grabbed hold of him, those giant fingers closing into a fist where she'd been standing just moments before. There was a sudden exhale of breath as all that weight clamped around his ribcage. Then the Fae vanished from sight. He reappeared 50 feet in the air. "Eden!" She and Jessie shouted at the same time, their voices blending together. There was suddenly a lot of shouting, but death didn't come for the Fae just yet. Instead of lifting Eden immediately to its mouth, the creature took a moment to savor its prize, whipping him back and forth as though he weighed no more than a doll. If he'd been mortal, his neck would have already snapped. As things stood, he was getting close. "A little help?" he gasped. Kiera clapped a hand over her mouth, staring in horror. "What can we do?" Evander picked up the Fae's bow and fired 2 arrows, handling it with almost as much skill as the archer possessed himself. One of them glanced off the troll's brow, while the other grazed its eye. There was a mighty howl, and the creature's hand tightened around the Fae's ribs. "Not that!" Eden cried, struggling against those crushing fingers. There was little point. They had wrapped around him from knees to chest. "Anything but that!" The friends shared a stricken glance, watching from what felt like miles away. Jessie was already taking off his cloak, probably remembering a similar situation wherein he was the one held aloft by some monstrous creature, and Eden sprinted up its leg. But even if he were to make the transformation, the others didn't see what good it would do. The odds of a single wolf making a difference against a cave troll were little better than if he happened to stay a man. "Just think a moment," Kiera stammered, grabbing his sleeve to halt the process. "You can't tear him loose. We must get the creature to release him." But they were out of time, and the troll was out of patience. Without a hint of warning, it swung Eden towards its mouth, already looking towards the others, debating who would come next. It was the only bit of luck the Fae received, because it didn't see when he ripped the silver clasp from his cloak and jammed it into the creature's gums. It let out an ear-splitting yowl as it jerked back in pain, swinging its arms in violent windmills and scraping the Fae on the trees. There was a muffled cry, followed by a soft whimper. A shower of blood hit the ground by their feet. 7 hells! Evander took a step forward, those immortal eyes blazing with rage. He took an instant to consider his options, then he grabbed the sword from Jessie's belt and paced forward, burying it deep inside the beast's leg. It vanished to the hilt, but instead of ripping it out, he pushed it still deeper, skewering through bone until it came through the other side. The creature let out a hair-raising roar of fury, its leg hobbled, bending slightly at the knee. That was when he started climbing. It was one of those moments that would remain lodged in Kiera's brain forever, a visual that was impossible to truly forget. There was no pause between one movement and another, no time for panic, let alone fear. Hands passed over hands, swinging lightly away from the forest floor, before the path was even, and Evander merely paced forward, walking straight vertical up the side of the troll. The vampire's logic was simple. If he couldn't get Eden down, he'd join him instead. But there was nothing simple about what happened next. 7 hells, Kiera breathed, taking a faltering step back. She'd said it aloud this time, though there had scarcely been a moment that she and Jessie hadn't been thinking it. They were spectators now to games beyond what either could imagine, silent observers that could look but not touch, as the Eternals above them passed into something more. It didn't take long for Evander to scale the length of the troll, and the Fae glanced up sharply the second he arrived. There was a moment when he stared in disbelieving silence, blinking slowly as strands of blood-matted hair fell into his eyes. Then his face tightened in misplaced concern. "Evander?" he asked, only to reaffirm it to himself, still unable to reconcile the sight of the vampire standing upon the monster's palm. "What are you—" He choked into silence, coughing up a mouthful of blood. The vampire was beside him in a moment, steadying the Fae as best he could, while discreetly testing the strength of those entrapping fingers at the same time. Whatever determination he made clearly wasn't to his liking, but he'd committed himself already. He was there to stay. "It's a fine mess you've gotten yourself into," he murmured, kicking savagely at the troll's teeth as they were lifting again to his mouth. "Is this one of your habits? I'd like to be prepared." The Fae's eyes flashed with a trace of humor, followed by a thundering clasp of pain. "Just go!" "Right," Evander interrupted with a wry smile, dislodging a tooth and hurling it vengefully into the creature's eye. "I'm going to leave you up here alone. I think you know better than that." Their eyes met for a brief moment, then Eden looked away. "What is your plan?" he asked softly. The vampire took a moment to assess, then lifted slowly to his feet. His dark eyes caught those first searing rays of sunlight as the endless night finally gave way to a new dawn. "I'm going to take off that finger and ram it down the beast's throat." Somehow, even so far beneath the action, the words seemed to carry. Jessie and Kiera shared a stricken glance before jumping up and down, waving their arms and shouting at the same time. The Fae seemed to share the sentiment. "No, that's a bad plan," he stammered, echoing the vampire's earlier words. "Oh no, are you worried?" Evander quipped, tilting his head to consider the angles as he prepared for the assault. "Does it freeze your chest with panic? Are you unable to pull in a breath? It might be good for you to worry about someone else for a change. It will at least be fair." The Fae stared in silence as he pushed to his feet, wedging the edge of his boot beneath the troll's yellowed claw. There was a faint splintering as he leveraged his strength against it. The second it was high enough, he took it in his arms, forcefully prying it away from the Fae's body. At that point, Kiera suddenly realized what was going to happen next. "He's going to drop him," she gasped, reaching for Jessie. "Eden's about to fall." No sooner had she said the words than the troll's finger snapped backward, releasing the Fae in the same instant. He plummeted in a freefall toward the ground as the vampire spiraled in a tight circle, keeping a taut grip on his intended weapon and wrenching bone from bone. Jessie caught hold of Eden just as the troll let out a high-pitched wail above them, throwing back its head and raging like a wounded bull. The vampire charged in at the same time, wielding the severed finger like a javelin and driving it straight into the creature's mouth. "Evander!" Eden's voice rang loud in the sudden quiet, echoing from tree to tree as the vampire momentarily disappeared from sight. The troll made a sudden gagging motion, grabbing at its neck before its eyes abruptly widened and it let out an almost comical hiccup. It crashed to the ground a second later, blood seeping into the earth. The impact was so strong and the sound was so loud that for a fleeting moment the friends were able to register nothing further. The Fae had fought his way from the shifter's arms, but the second his feet made contact with the ground, he toppled right back down, coughing in the dust. It took a few seconds to settle, then his eyes lifted to a pair of boots. "Do you have any other fun ideas?" Evander asked crossly. "Or can we return to bed?" Chapter 3. For the rest of the day, the Fae wasn't precisely mobile. With their utmost caution, the others checked to make sure the troll was no longer breathing, then made their way back to camp, only to find that the tent had collapsed when the ground started shaking. Jesse rebuilt it quickly and helped Eden inside, patiently ignoring the half-hearted protests as he removed the Fae's shirt and wrapped a bandage around his ribs. Most of them had been crushed in the monster's vice-like grip. Even an immortal would need a day to recover. They hoped. "How is he?" Kiera asked quietly, the second the shifter stepped outside. It was hard to tell from the slew of profanities and threats that had echoed from inside. "I mean, he's clearly awake." Jesse rubbed his eyes, flicking a piece of bloodied gauze from his cloak. "He's most definitely awake," he agreed wearily, "but apart from that, I could not tell you for certain. This isn't the first time he's been broken in a way that would kill a regular man. I never know where that line is for his people. I never know what's best for me to do. Visit the 7 hells, according to the Fae. But it was a point well made. When dealing with immortal problems, it was often best to seek immortal advice." "Should we go to the river again?" she asked softly. "Take him to see the naiads?" Jesse gazed thoughtfully through the forest, as if he could see the sparkling water just beyond. "Yes, perhaps, though we mustn't abuse such generosity. They might form a union." The conversation stopped as the vampire walked back into the camp. "Or we could ask someone who's seen this kind of injury before." "Hello, Evander," Kiera greeted him sweetly, watching as he flung the wood he'd collected towards the fire with such unearthly force as to dent the surrounding rocks. "Have a nice walk?" The vampire had not responded well to the incident with the troll. It had started with the Fae. "Are you all right?" he'd asked quietly. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wild with concern. When Eden had nodded weakly, then doubled over in pain, he'd knelt swiftly to the ground, uncoiling his body with gentle hands. "It's all right," he soothed, brushing the Fae's hair from his eyes. "The worst is over." He propped him up delicately, unlacing the top of his shirt with a single hand. A pattern of violent bruises were already clouding up the base of his stomach, as though he'd spilled a jar of ink. "There isn't much torn skin," he murmured, peeling back the tunic. "I doubt you'll need stitches. But some of these fractures might need to be set." He froze in surprise, as Eden pushed away his hand. "It's all right," he panted, easing himself free. "Those are things I can do myself." It was casually done, yet the rejection was unmistakable. The only question was whether his problem was with the vampire touching his bare skin or the copious amounts of blood. The others froze across the trampled clearing, while Evander jerked back his arm like he'd been given a burn. "We have asked so much of you already, there is no need to add to the burden," Eden added quickly, though he kept his eyes safe on the ground. "Thank you, Evander. I am in your debt." The trouble had continued with the troll. "It's definitely dead," Jesse said as confirmation, though after witnessing its final moments, no one had doubted the alternative. He nudged it with his shoe, then paused suddenly, looking the body up and down. A second later, his eyes lifted to the vampire. "Do you want to... maybe..." Evander glanced across the clearing, rigid as a stone. "What?" The shifter blushed furiously, already regretting bringing it up. "There's a lot of blood. Might last you for a while." Without knowing the exact reason, Kiera was suddenly certain this was a rather terrible thing to say. The vampire's jaw tightened, and for a split second, that newfound peace waned. "I would not drink such a thing, any more than you would eat it." He glanced down at the Fae, before pacing abruptly in the opposite direction. "We are not the savages you might think." At that point, Jesse had wisely extracted Eden from the clearing. It wasn't until they were limping away that Kiera saw the grooves in the earth and realized how fast the vampire must have changed directions to reach him. It wasn't until she saw the cracks in the stone that she realized it almost wasn't fast enough. He almost hadn't gotten there in time. "We almost lost him." She said it quietly, almost to herself, but Evander froze dead still beside her. His lovely face tightened with a look that was impossible to describe, before settling on something rather cold. "It's only a matter of time," he replied shortly. "We should prepare for that now." From the looks of things, that sentiment had not improved. "Would you like to see him?" she asked softly, gesturing with a tilt of her head. Instead of standing guard at the entrance of the tent like she might have expected, Evander had kept a marked distance from the Fae, as if he could no longer stand the sight. When she had casually inquired to the reason, the vampire replied that he was giving the Fae time to grow a brain. "I think he'd like to see you," she coaxed gently. "I think he'd like to say thanks." Evander spared her the barest of glances before turning away. "He said it already. There is no need to say it again." She stared a moment longer, then let out a quiet sigh. The immortals matched each other in every other regard. It should have come as no surprise that they also matched each other in pride. "All right, well, I am going hunting," he interrupted tersely. "I will be back before dawn." He was gone before the others had time to register the statement, before they could even see in which direction he'd gone. Jesse glanced around the empty trees, as if there might still be a chance to catch him, before letting out a tired sigh of his own. "I guess I'll be keeping watch then," he muttered, settling by the fire. "All night." Kiera stood a moment longer, then slipped inside the tent. Eden was propped up exactly where Jesse had left him, angled like a broken king atop all their earthly belongings, in the vague hope that the bones in his chest would somehow manage to set. He glanced up immediately as she entered, beautiful as ever, but white as a ghost. "Where is the vampire?" She paused in the entryway, wondering if he realized how many times he'd asked that precise question since Evander had burst into their lives. "He's not here," she answered evasively, not wanting to make him feel any worse. "I think he was going to to fetch some water for the flasks." Eden absorbed this without blinking, never breaking her gaze. "He doesn't wish to see me?" "You cannot lie to a Fae." She didn't even attempt it. She changed the subject instead. "Why did you tell me to breathe?" she asked abruptly. "In that moment when you appeared in front of me, it was the only thing you said. Not to run, not to duck, just to breathe." He gazed up at her, having already forgotten the moment himself. "I was about to throw you a long distance and very hard. If there wasn't something to bolster your ribs when you landed, there was a chance they might break." She nodded with a belated shiver, trying to act more composed than she felt. "Did you take a breath before Jesse caught you?" He tried to smile, but it was more of a grimace. "Not so much." He shifted aside to make room as she settled on the blankets beside him, adding a light-hearted, "It's always easier to remember these things for other people." She nodded slowly, then slapped him across the face. "You enjoyed that." His hair flew back and he sucked in a quick breath, staring back at her with a mixture of pain and surprise. Outside the tent, Jesse glanced up sharply as well, debating whether he wanted to go inside, before deciding that he was much happier tending to the fire. "I enjoyed that?" he repeated once he'd gathered the breath to speak. He lifted a reflexive hand, then lowered it just as fast, purposely ignoring the angry welt rising on his face. "Not this," she gestured to the bed, then pointed back to the woods. "Back there." His eyes flashed with temper, but he spoke with a perfect calm. "You called for me," he answered flatly. "I was in a completely different part of the forest keeping watch when you somehow walked into a troll. I saved your life, and you loved every second," she finished, shaking her head. "This whole thing, this whole terrible plan, it couldn't have worked out any better for you. Since we left Farion, you've been searching for a reason not to return. Since we left the Hollow, you can't even hide your smile." He lowered his gaze, twisting his fingers in the blanket. "I've been trying to lift spirits." "We are likely marching to our death," she said flatly. "This isn't the time to lift spirits and take stupid chances. This is the time to make plans. I did not wish for this outcome. Neither did Jesse, neither did Evander. We do not want to face down a dragon by ourselves." "We are not facing down anything." He fell silent at the look on her face. There was no point in denying it. From the moment the idea entered his head, the Fae had been utterly consumed. He parted his lips to reply, then bowed his head to his chest. "I do not mean to twist your arm. Regardless of personal sentiment, everything I said at the Hollow was true. If this is the situation, there isn't another way. This is the only..." "This is exactly what you want. Another monster, another adventure, another way to avoid whatever things you're running from that make it so bloody easy for you to upend our lives." A cold silence fell between them, one that told her she'd gone too far. It was difficult to chastise a man in such a condition, especially given that nothing he'd said was technically untrue. It made sense, the points he'd made about the dragon, and he'd just thrown his body in front of a cave troll in a desperate gamble to save her life. But nothing I said was untrue either. He pulled in a silent breath, searching for patience. "You are upset." "I'm right." She got up and walked to the door. Then she let out a sigh. "Eden, I'm upset." She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see him still angry, but there wasn't a hint of frustration on that lovely face. If anything, the Fae looked uncharacteristically repentant. "I cannot blame you for that," he said softly. "There is truth in everything you said, and whatever hand we have been given, this is much to put on one so young." The face of another immortal burned through her mind. "It is much to put on anyone," she answered, "especially those who are doomed to care." The vampire came back much sooner than any of them had expected, meaning Jesse would no longer have to keep watch for the four of them after the sun went down. It was already starting to slip behind the trees when Eden wandered out of the tent and found them by the fire. His shirt was gone, but a blanket was wrapped around his shoulders. He shivered a little in the breeze. "Is everything all right?" Jesse asked swiftly, half pushing from his seat. "I could try to find some more of that..." Eden shook his head quickly, glancing at the vampire. "May I speak with you?" "You should get some rest," Evander answered without looking up from the flames. "God knows what trouble you'll find in the morning." There was a moment of silence, followed by a quiet sigh. Please? Evander's eyes lifted, staring with a fixed gaze at the forest. Then he pushed abruptly to his feet and crossed the campsite, looking with the same expressionless gaze at the Fae. Speak then. Eden's eyes flickered to the others, and his hand tightened upon the blanket. There wasn't a great chance he'd make it very far in the forest, but he was certainly willing to try. Perhaps somewhere with a little, right here is fine. In hindsight, the vampire might have regretted insisting on that point. Eden stared at him for a long time, almost as if he was searching for the words on Evander's own face. A rush of emotion heated his skin, before leaving a kind of hollow in its wake. I'm sorry, he murmured, almost too soft for the mortals to hear. Every time I hear you sigh, every time your brow tightens, I'm sorry, Evander. I never wish to cause you any pain. The vampire was frozen so unnaturally still, Kiera might have thought he'd been turned to stone. She couldn't see the look on his face, only the dark ripples of his hair, but it must have been something truly extraordinary, because the Fae proceeded with the greatest of care. When you first began travelling with us, he continued quietly, when I asked you why you had spared me, you said that you didn't know. You asked if I knew the reason. He paused a moment, then shook his head. I still do not. You are an enigma to me, Evander. A perplexity I have never before seen. I do not always understand you. I do not believe you always understand me. But if you are certain of nothing else, please let it be this. I never wish to do anything that might hurt you. If only he'd been able to leave it there. If only there was a less difficult road that lay between them. But he added one final conclusion, something between a whisper and a thought. There are some things I cannot give you. Chapter 4. Jessie took the first watch. Evander took the second. So when Kiera opened her eyes the next morning, all three of the friends were pressed against each other inside the tent. It was a crunch they hadn't known before the addition of the vampire. It would never have been possible, because one of them would always have been on watch. And, despite emerging each morning in a state of mild asphyxiation, it was hard not to feel rather tender about it as well. Kiera turned ever so slightly, warming with a restful smile. Her boys. She'd never admit it out loud, but that was the way she'd started to think about them. Not the most accurate description, given that one of them had been roaming under the stars for centuries, but when they slept, all of those timelines vanished. Their differences and stories blended into a shared adolescence, and the muted light painted them all the same. It had been in precisely such a moment the moniker first popped into her head. She'd been using it in secret every single day since. That morning, they didn't disappoint. They had each adjusted to each other's habits, in that they bore them now with relatively little complaint, but the result had made each one slightly peculiar themselves. Jessie had a tendency to steal the other's blankets, so Eden's hand stayed curled around the edge of his, even in sleep. The Fae often took a moment to fully orient upon waking, and spoke those first greetings in his native tongue rather than their own, and each of the men had begun to openly hate Kiera's long hair. It was a net, Eden had once described it, a suffocating, vindictive net. It was perhaps the greatest contradiction of all. Despite their apocalyptic circumstance, they gathered together at the end of each day. Just 3 teenagers caught on a never-ending camping trip. The least 3 likely teenagers to have ever met. She squirmed beneath the blankets a little, feeling 2 sets of legs pressing into her on either side. The first few times they'd attempted such a sleeping arrangement, Jessie had subtly positioned himself to be always between the barmaid and the Fae. But they had reached such a level of trust, he no longer seemed to mind. It was Kiera who minded now, always trapped like a child in the middle. "I have lost all feeling in my legs." She tried and failed to wiggle her toes. "Those bastards." On that cheery note, she propped onto her elbows and prepared to announce her plight to the others, only to find that Eden was already awake. You'd never have known by a mere glance at him. She'd never met a person who could freeze so completely still, but those blue eyes were open. They had been open for a long time. "Morning," she said softly. He startled and glanced in her direction, staring blankly for a moment before his eyes dilated into focus. "Sorry, what did you say?" There was something so disarmingly childlike about him in those moments, she could never find it in her heart to tease him. It was even more endearing when he forgot himself and spoke Fae. "Never mind." Jessie's breathing hitched, and he stirred beside her, reaching blindly for the girl he'd been cuddling with, only to find himself squeezing Eden's hand by mistake. The Fae glanced down with a hint of surprise, before lifting his eyes with a wry grin. "Good morning, sweetheart." Jessie pressed his face into the pillow with a groan. "We should have gotten a bigger tent." "No, this could be an interesting new dynamic," the Fae answered mischievously, refusing to release him. "Just imagine the possibilities. I could get you to carry books for me as well." Jessie yanked at his wrist, and Eden released him immediately, feeling the slightest of tears, as his arm was stretched further than he'd planned. Only Kiera saw the wince, because she was still pressed against him. It was how she got a closer look at his rib cage as well. "Look at you." Evander had said there wasn't much torn skin, but there was clearly a bit. The bandage Jessie had wrapped around his chest was already stained through, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the bruises, not even the violent colour, but the symmetry, line after line, finger stacked atop finger. The troll might have died in the forest, but his legacy was imprinted in the Fae's skin. Eden fidgeted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Kiera, I was only teasing about the—" "You know what I forgot to say the other night?" she interrupted quietly, still staring at the bandage. "Probably the most important thing, but it completely slipped my mind." His eyes flashed up warily, resting on her face. "I couldn't imagine. You said a lot." She sat there a moment longer, then met his gaze. "Thank you." The tension vanished as those blades they so seldom used against each other lowered back to their sides. His face softened immediately, and he flicked her cheek with a trace of a smile. "You're welcome." The two locked eyes with a silent reconciliation. "But we have greater problems now," he continued abruptly, that enchanting face growing stern. "Like how you exactly managed to walk into a cave troll in the first place." She closed her eyes with a pained expression as Jessie picked up on the trail. "That's a question I've been asking myself." He proceeded to embark upon a lecture that would have made his friends proud, if either had been paying attention. But Kiera had learned to tune such things out long before, and she was struck with the sudden suspicion that the Fae might have been casting attention away from himself. He'd slipped away the moment the shifter started talking, dressing in silence and throwing occasional glances at the door, like he was afraid of what might be waiting on the other side. Or what might not be waiting. "I'm sure he's still there," she whispered comfortingly. Eden lifted another finger to his ear, but rolled his eyes with an exasperated grin. The shifter eventually ranted himself out. They dug around in packs, folded their blankets, and forced their feet into boots that had yet to dry from the previous day's rain. The instant all three of them were ready, the Fae pulled back the door, only to pause immediately in the frame. Evander was sitting beside the fire, a beaming smile upon his face. If they actually were the world's unlikeliest of teenagers, the vampire was the one who'd been left out the most often in the rain. Literally. There was a fading imprint in the leaves where he'd lain down to rest, and a sprinkling of dew in his raven hair. It caught the light when he paced towards them, flinging into the air like a hailstorm of little diamonds raining down to the ground. "You're still here," Eden blurted without thinking. Over the duration of the nighttime hours, he'd come up with several things to say, whether the vampire had remained or not. None had been so simple. None had been so blunt. Evander's eyes twinkled with a smile. "Where else would I go?" he teased. "I told you already. I've committed myself to stay." The others shared a quick look behind Eden's back before discreetly extracting themselves from the conversation and settling beside the fire. Much as they liked to pry, there was something troublesome about doing it in such close proximity. They would do it from a distance instead. Eden lingered uncertainly by the tent. Evander lingered in front of him. While he was usually the one averting his gaze and making conversational exits, the vampire seemed cheerfully determined that morning to stand his ground and force the Fae to speak his mind. "You seem... well?" Kiera grimaced sympathetically as the Fae unravelled before her very eyes. All of the quick deflections and clever jabs he'd been practicing turned to ash beneath the vampire's steady gaze. Evander nodded slowly, still smiling. "I am well." There was a creak in the logs around the fire as Jessie leaned discreetly closer, whispering in Kiera's ear. "This is riveting. You should add it to that poem." For possibly the first time ever, neither of the immortals seemed to hear them. They were in their own world, playing by a set of rules that only one of them seemed to fully understand. Eden regarded him cautiously, like there was something beneath that smile to fear. "The other night," he began softly, "I was not speaking lightly. I understood what you were saying." Evander's eyes twinkled as they looked him up and down, lingering on the blood-stained clothes and intersecting bruises. "And you have made it easy. You are far less compelling this way." For the first time, this Fae was merely stunned. He stood there, straight-backed and lost as a misfired arrow, searching desperately for words that would never come. By the time he came back to his senses, the vampire had already left and joined Jessie by the fire. A piece of parchment had been smoothed onto a stone between them, covered in etchings and tiny scribbles of ink. Kiera leaned forward curiously, examining it for the first time. "Is this a map?" she asked in surprise. "Where did you get it?" "We didn't get it," Jessie answered with a touch of pride. "We made it last night. Me and Evander. Well, mostly Evander, but he's been wandering the realm for a very long time." She looked between them, shocked to the core. To be honest, she didn't know what was more surprising, that the vampire and the shifter had willingly embarked upon a group activity, or that one had allowed the other to take credit. In the end, she settled on the most insignificant of questions. "How did you get the parchment?" There was a brief pause, then Jessie cleared his throat. "We tore a page from the back of your book." She lifted her head slowly, levelling them with the same murderous look. A sudden hush fell over the clearing as they stared back in silence. Jessie was apologetic. Evander was blank. "There was nothing on it," he said flatly. The shifter dropped his eyes to the ground, trying to keep from smiling. "Proceed." "Right. Well, this is a rendering of the realm as best as Evander remembers it." Jessie knelt to the ground beside it, eager to continue with her presentation. There are apparently several places that get hot enough to be appealing to a dragon, but most of them are at least sparsely populated. Eden wandered over with a frown as she glanced in confusion between them. "Why would that be a problem?" she asked. What does a dragon mind if a place happens to be populated? You'd think they would prefer it." "But it would have been spotted," Evander interjected quietly. "In my experience, dragons do not kill neatly. There would have been survivors, and they would have spread the word." Kiera looked up slowly, fixing on his face. "In your experience?" The vampire shrugged, as if such things could scarcely be avoided. "I have seen a dragon," he admitted, "from a distance, long ago, and not the kind that you have described. It would likely have been much smaller, and still the wingspan was immense." His face stilled at the memory, before he forced himself onward. "At any rate, most creatures will not make a nest somewhere it can be disturbed. If we are searching for a land both hot and isolated," he pointed to a far-flung spot on the map, "this is the only place which comes to mind." Like they'd planned it, the rest of them leaned closer, peering down at the map. To be honest, the rolling valleys and jagged peaks made little sense to Kiera. Yes, she could understand what they represented, but each one was layered atop another, and there were too many to keep track. While the others saw past the topography to things like population centers and the fastest path through an agricultural sprawl, she was blown away by the sheer scale. She could have stood there looking for hours, poring over every inch of it, a place she'd lived her entire life. "What do you think?" Jesse asked quietly, studying Eden's face for a reaction. It had felt strange making plans with the vampire as he slept. "I mean, we need to head somewhere." The Thane nodded slowly, never taking his eyes from the map. Since leaving the Marrow's house, the companions had been traveling west with no particular destination, just as they'd been traveling north in the weeks before. There was a strange comfort in it. Like they went far enough, they might simply see a dragon in the clouds and follow it home. "I have never been that far across the sea myself," he admitted, staring at the map with a thoughtful frown. "I know of no one who has. Perhaps one man, but we can no longer ask him." Several times, his eyes flickered back toward the mainland, towards the places he was familiar with himself. There were deserts there as well, endless, scorching plains. But the vampire was right about the people. If a three-headed dragon was torching the skies, they would have heard. "It is a good rendering," he remarked, almost without thinking. "It makes me wonder how you know some of these places so well." Evander hesitated and smiled. "You need only ask me." The two shared a swift glance. "It is a remarkable rendering," Kiera murmured, winding her fingers along an intricately drawn river. "Why must you lay it all out like this, if we'll all be staying together?" Before she even finished the sentence, she understood her mistake. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but in case there was any confusion, Jesse tapped his finger along the edge. "You need to memorize it," he said quietly. "We all need to memorize it, in case something should happen. This quest is too important to fail because not all of us knew the route." To her great surprise, it was Evander who took her through it. Together, the two of them followed his musical voice up through the Seraphine forest and down again through the river country, where the people were hearty and the earth sucked the boots from your legs, up again to the frosted mountains, avoiding for some reason the wide valley in the middle, before pouring out near a dwarven settlement at the base of the wooded peaks. 100 tiny landmarks stood out along the way, but those were the points they were looking for. If they managed to make it through all that, there was just the small matter of crossing the great sea. The vampire did not usually speak so much. She got the feeling he was making a concerted effort to try. Whatever the reason, he was a patient teacher. He'd ask her questions, point out details she hadn't thought of, imprinting the image slowly into her mind, so that in the end she did not need to scramble for answers. It was more like remembering a picture. She sat there a long time after he was gone, remembering with a smile. There were some days when the hike set before the friends seemed endless. The scenery, while beautiful, held no variation, and every league that passed beneath their feet blended into the next. It was not that way for the next week that they travelled. It was like wandering in a dream. "What about those ones?" Kiera asked excitedly, pointing to a cluster of crystallite flowers on the side of the trail. "Eden, what are those ones called?" He let out a patient sigh. "Those are Imoneth." She bounded past him, forgetting the rules that forbade her from ever walking first upon the forest trail. "And those? What about those?" "They are Hadosen." She stared as long as her attention would allow, marvelling at the delicate iridescence, before springboarding to the next. A grove of silver-tipped roses, sprigs of canthus and larkspurs of the clearest blue. She tripped over a tangle of what looked like sakura lilies before catching herself on the trailing branches of the trees above them, each one tipped with blossoms of a vivid tangerine. "What about these?" she breathed, trailing her fingers through them. "Eden?" He glanced over with a hint of irritation. The usual indulgence was long ago spent. "Kiera, I've told you already. You're not even trying to remember." She appeared in front of him, red-cheeked and grinning ear to ear. "This is impossibly lovely. I think we should stay." He stared for a split second before breaking with a quiet laugh. A pair of light fingers tucked back her hair, and without seeming to think about it, he pressed a sudden kiss to her forehead. "Perhaps you will come back to this place," he remarked, as they continued strolling along the trail. "It's unlikely the dragon will eat all of us. Perhaps this is where you wish to remain." In truth, it was a question she had deliberately refrained from asking herself. The task set before them had swollen to take up all available space. She could not imagine anything after. "Perhaps this is where you wish to remain as well," she replied with a little grin. While he'd been making an observation, she'd been making a joke. The Fae would not remain anywhere. Such stagnancy wasn't in his blood. That being said, he was clearly in his element. There was something about such natural beauty that made him light up from the inside. The bruises from the troll were fading. Each breath was a little easier than the one before. When the wind picked up and the air scented with the blooms above them, she could almost see the colour returning to his face, like a man coming back to life. As usual, she was not the only one to have noticed. The brighter the face shone, the more the vampire seemed to warm around him, drifting on the periphery before venturing close as he dared. He ghosted up behind them, falling in pace alongside. "Would you like me to eat the girl?" Her heart faltered, and she slipped upon the trail. "That's a bold joke, vampire." Eden threw him a sharp look, though he couldn't help but smile. It was the same joke he'd made many times himself, though it's not entirely unwarranted. Jessie shoved past them, draping an arm across her shoulders. "Eden, if you encourage this, I will strangle you with those bloomin' braids." The Fae chuckled softly, watching as they stormed up ahead. "I like your braids," Evander murmured, catching one with a flick of his hand and trailing it through his fingers. "I've always wondered how they might feel." Eden froze where he stood, right in the middle of the trail. His body was still, but his heart was pounding, as if he'd run a great ways and then come to a sudden stop. Although he did not pull away himself, there was such a look on his face that Evander lowered his hand slowly, looking almost nervous to have found himself so close. The Fae's eyes lifted then, burning like a brand. "Do not touch." He didn't say it aloud. He didn't have to. It scorched the air between them like the thrill of lightning before a storm. Before Evander could say a word, he knocked past him, sweeping past the others and vanishing up the trail. The rest of them stood in awkward silence before heading silently after him. In a move that was perhaps unwise, Kiera slackened her pace to match Evander's. "I know what you wish," she said quietly. "This is not the way to do it." It was a tricky thing, offering advice to a person who'd been alive for hundreds of years. It was trickier still when that person happened to be a vampire. But despite the obvious differences between them, she couldn't help but feel the slightest bit of protective of Evander. Perhaps it was the natural reaction to seeing someone wishing so earnestly being shot down every time. It was why she was so surprised by the vampire's smile. "You are sweet," he remarked, without inflection, like he was noticing for the first time. "But in this case we disagree. Think on your own troubles, darling," he winked. "I will think on mine." He swept up the trail without another word, leaving she and Jessie frozen in his wake. They stared after him for a moment, before turning back to each other. "Did he just call you darling?" the shifter asked in astonishment. "Did he just wink?" She shook her head slowly, setting off once again. "The world is upside down." In what would later be described as an act of betrayal, Jessie volunteered to go hunting that evening. He also volunteered Kiera to go with him. "Must I?" she complained, dragging her shoes in the dirt. It wasn't that she was particularly squeamish. The girl had spent the last few years dutifully decapitating fish. But there was something different about being there when it actually happened, bearing witness to the moment the light vanished from a creature's eyes. "Come on, it will be fun." Jessie took her wrist with a grin and dragged her casually into the trees, muttering under his breath, "A lot more fun than sticking around here." Things had not gotten easier between the Fae and the vampire. If anything, those tensions were poised to break. There had not been a word between them since that fateful moment, when Evander made a casual comment about the weather. Eden started playing with a blade. "If you think the shared pleasure of a ritualistic killing is a fun way for couples to bond, then we have more serious problems than I thought." She marched petulantly through the dense underbrush, swatting manically at the air. "Did you see the size of that bug?" Jessie smiled to himself, then glanced over his shoulder. "You called us a couple." Her heart stilled. "Would you not?" "I would." The two shared a secret smile. "But you should know that I've been seeing other people," he continued apologetically. She let out a breath of laughter, sliding her hand into his. "Cheating already? Wow." He nodded to himself as they walked along, holding back branches to let her through. "There was this goblin at the last tavern we visited, and a starlit crone in the woods before that. She asked me to make something of my life, and I left her." She shook his head sadly, like the memory still weighed heavy on his mind. "I have regretted it every day since." Kiera laughed again, scaring away any potential animals they were supposed to find. It was a fact she remembered a second later, shooting a reflexive glance back towards the camp. "I'm afraid we're fated to be the only couple." Jessie scoffed, as if he'd seen worse. "I'm not so sure about that." She stopped walking, laughing again. "You can't be serious. I thought Eden was going to cut off his fingers and reenact that grisly scene with the troll." Jessie smiled as well, remembering that quick flash of the blade. "I'm not saying anything's going to happen, but you can tell they like each other." "Oh yeah?" she quipped. "How?" "Because they watch each other." There was something so simple about the way he said it, borderline naive, though she sensed a deeper wisdom at the same time. Perhaps it was that simple. Perhaps the rest was just foolishness of their own making. Perhaps it was not so uncommon, but plagued every couple just the same. "Easy as that, huh?" He shrugged, blushing with a shy smile. "I watch you." Dinner was a strained affair that night, and equally brief. The moment the rest of them were finished eating, Eden kicked some dirt over the fire and set about cleaning up the meal. I will meet you inside, he said without looking, as the others filed into the tent. He had been rushing things along the entire evening, like he was fearful to allow too much silence to pass. With a lot less care than usual, he dumped out the remains of their meal and began scrubbing vigorously at the fire-lit cauldron, white knuckles clutched upon a rag. He didn't see the vampire come up beside him, not until he was sliding it from his hands. Can I help you with this? Eden froze beneath his touch, taking a breath to steady himself. A terrible silence stretched on between them, before he raised his head slowly, staring deep into the vampire's eyes. Stop. The pot was forgotten as the two men lifted slowly to their feet. I was going to stop, Evander said quietly, standing his ground. After the other night, I truly was. He warmed with that same inexplicable smile. But then you told me not to. Are you addled? Eden said sharply, fighting the urge to smack him upside the head. That is not what I said, vampire. But it's what I heard, Angel. Evander flicked him beneath the chin, pairing it with the world's most infuriating wink. Try to keep up. He left the face standing beside the fire, trembling with such bottled fury it was a miracle it didn't explode right out of him. It wasn't until he turned slowly around, still rigid as a blade, that Kiera and Jesse had the sense to scramble away from the door of the tent. It flew open a second later, letting in a gust of cold air. I think I may kill him. With most people, such a thing could be written off as mere exaggeration, but the Fae were not generally prone to exaggeration, and Eden looked like death itself. Kiera lifted her hands, trying to appear rational. I think you may wish to sleep on that. It seems a shame to travel so far with someone only to end up killing them before the end. It isn't a shame, Eden replied, still frozen by the entry. It happens every day. The quiet chorus of laughter from outside unspooled him still further. Take off your boots, Jesse. I will need you to shift. He held out a blind hand, firing off orders like a wartime general. And give me that blade. Jesse shook his head, backing carefully out of reach. I was asked to show leniency with the vampire. He flashed a winning smile. This is me being lenient. At that point, since it was already going to be a terrible night, Kiera decided she might as well make it even worse. I don't suppose you've given any thought to... He is most certainly not sleeping inside the tent. Chapter 5. Happy birthday to you. Kiera awoke the next morning to a gentle kiss, not unlike the one she'd been dreaming about just a few seconds before. The only difference was that when she opened her eyes, there were two men sitting on the bed instead of just one. They smiled at the same time, then Eden leaned closer. Now guess which one of us that was? Jessie shoved him with a grin while she pushed drowsily onto her elbows, the familiar sing-song still ringing in her ears. The world blinked quickly into focus, but she still couldn't string things together. She simply stared in sleepy confusion, half hidden behind tangles of hair. How did you know it was my birthday? She asked in astonishment. Jessie squeezed her ankle beneath the covers, those green eyes twinkling as they swept her up and down. It was one of the first things you told me, in the woods before we reached Farion. You said you were born on the last day of spring. I did? Those early days felt so long ago, she could scarcely remember, and she had apparently been the one talking. If she could scarcely remember, then how in the world did he? And that's today? She hitched herself up with a hint of embarrassment. A girl should know her 18th birthday. How did you possibly... She trailed off, looking at the Fae. My people are rather attuned to those things, he said with a teasing smile. We wouldn't be very good custodians of this place otherwise. He leaned back on his heels. I cannot remember the moral consensus, but are you of age now? Is this when you're said to have left childhood behind? A typical immortal question to a typical mortal affair. I have always been of age, thank you very much. She tossed back her hair with a dainty scowl, but by now she was grinning like all the rest. I've always been a great deal more mature than you. Eden nodded slowly, before lighting with sudden mischief. I may now attempt to court you. He turned in preemptive triumph to the shifter. Are you worried? Jessie shot him a sideways look. I don't know how you could attempt to court anyone with those repellent ears. She threw open her arms. Do not quarrel, it is my birthday. Let us go to the carnival. Let us go dancing in the city square. Let us treat each other to a fine dinner, followed by a relaxing soak in the tub. The men smiled sympathetically. Their muddy boots were in a line by the door. I'll tell you what, Jessie began cautiously, hedging his bets. How about instead of doing that, we walk to the hottest place on earth to do battle with a dragon? There was a scathing silence. Then she pushed past him out of the tent. I cannot believe you would make that joke on my birthday. Eden lingered a moment longer, before shaking his head. I cannot believe you would make that joke on her birthday. Kiera took a step outside the tent, blinking in the bright sunlight, then froze like an arrow had pinned her to the ground. The camp was there as she'd left it, except it was nothing like how she'd left it. A spare blanket had been set in the grass in the middle, laden with a woodland feast. It was all of her favourites. There were bursts of wisteria and snowbells dripped in honey, huckleberries and walnuts, with a handful of patiently shelled pistachios on the side. Freshly picked apples, still warm from the morning sun, had been set beside a pitcher of water with tiny lavender petals still floating inside. Not a rodent in sight. You did this? Eden swept past her without answering, but Jessie paused by her side. His arm found its way, as it so often did, to her shoulders, and they regarded the blanket together. Not just me. Eden insisted upon helping. Then he insisted upon taking charge. He slipped into a hilarious impression. We must make a great fuss. She would love a great fuss. She let out a breath of laughter, leaning against him with a giant grin. He was right. The last birthday she'd celebrated had been before her shift at the tavern. A quick bite of pastry from the baker's before back to scrubbing pictures and descaling the day's fish. She suspected this year would be much better. Such a commotion for a mortal's birthday. Evander swept into the clearing, his dark eyes twinkling with a smile. All so we can celebrate her decaying before our very eyes. Come now, Eden chided. They don't get many of those. In honor of the occasion, it appeared the immortals had called a temporary truce. One was standing a great distance from the other, but it was a truce nonetheless. Kiera clapped her hands in delight and hurried to examine the table, explaining with great authority the significance of each item as Jessie indulged her with a grin. The men stared after her with the same smile before their eyes slowly drifted to each other. In another contrast from the day before, Eden's hair fell loose to his shoulders, pulled half back in the custom of his people. Not a braid in sight. Evander, I'm sorry, the vampire interrupted quietly. His gaze never faltered, but his voice was sincere. I did not wish to upset you. He paused. I will not ask to help with the washing again. Eden stared back without a hint of emotion, regarding him in silence. Then, all at once, a trace of humour warmed the edges of his face. It's for the best. You would have been terrible at it. They turned away from each other, both harbouring secret smiles. So tell us, princess. Jessie leaned forward on his elbows as the others settled around the blanket, whether they had any intention of eating or not. There was a stain of berries around his lips, yet his eyes narrowed shrewdly as a teacher on examination day. "How do you feel?" By now, Kiera had fashioned herself a crown of mayflowers and had silently vowed not to remove it until her next birthday. She considered a weighted moment, then offered a grave reply. "Entirely different." She threw a disdainful glance at the immortals, as if the act of explaining would be quite tiresome. "You wouldn't understand." Eden laughed aloud. Even Evander had to smile. It had been said as a jest, but she realized all at once how truly strange it must have been for them. To give such prominence to a single day, to celebrate with someone at the dawn of such an inevitably short life. Did they even celebrate birthdays anymore? Or was that a mortal consolation? "I have no gift for you," Eden said apologetically, gesturing vaguely to the woods. "Options were in limited supply, but I wrote an inscription in one of your books." When she pushed at once to retrieve it, he caught her sleeve. "I would ask that you keep it to yourself." "Quite mysterious." "All right." The two shared a hidden smile. "I have something for you as well," Evander said unexpectedly, reaching beneath the blanket and pulling up a bouquet of the same crystallite flowers she'd been marveling at before. "These were half a day's journey behind us," she said in surprise, still dazzled by the sight of them. "Over 6 leagues across the slopes. And now they are here, for your birthday." Detached as the vampire could be, there was something remarkably observant about him as well. He noticed little things about the rest of them others might have missed. Things they avoided, things that made them smile. It might have seemed trivial, but vampires were not used to smiles. He was learning to hoard them, seeking them out wherever he could. Sometimes a bit more pointedly than others. "You may enjoy them," he added, nudging them closer in silent command. She picked up the bouquet, deliberately avoiding the eyes of the others, then lifted it to her face for a fragrant sniff. Like silver and sunlight, and something else, cloyingly sweet. "They're lovely," she beamed at him. "Thank you, Evander." He walked away with a little smile of his own, feeling pleased. It wasn't until he'd vanished into the woods and she lifted them again that Eden reached over and caught her wrist. "Those are poison." She turned to him incredulously. "What?" "They are sleepers," he confided softly. "Toxic in large quantities, though we sometimes use small bits in our ointments and salves. To Evander's credit, I don't think he knew." "Why would he? What use does a vampire have for such knowledge?" "Do not lick your fingers," Jessie whispered teasingly. "You'll miss the rest of the day." She gave them a bracing look, then threw them as far as she could into the forest, towards the ravine where the vampire would not see them by mistake. She washed her hands carefully when she was finished, trickling them with lavender water and wiping them on the blanket. It was not a spare blanket, she realized. It was Evander's. Her head suddenly lifted at the thought. "That was incredibly thoughtful," she murmured quietly, staring at the place where he'd wandered into the trees. "I would never have guessed him thoughtful when he first arrived." Eden flashed her a look, but said nothing. "You can't be talking about Evander," Jessie exclaimed, laughing at the thought. "Our resident vampire. That's the thoughtful creature of whom you speak." She elbowed him in the ribs, so hard the crown slipped into her eyes. "I thought you were coming round to him," she accused, pushing it back to center. "As a cartographer, yes. As a boon companion, that is a resoundful no." Jessie chuckled again, shaking his head. "The man leaves no footprints. He doesn't even smile." "He smiles," Eden interrupted, lifting his head. For a moment, those eyes, which could be so guarded, glowed a particular kind of warm. "At times, he smiles." It looked like he was going to say more, but a flush colored his cheeks, and he pushed to his feet as well, murmuring something unintelligible about tending to the fire. The couple stared after him before Jessie leaned discreetly closer, speaking quietly into her ear. "I have something for you as well, but I cannot give it to you here." He pulled in a breath, abruptly nervous, before tilting his head to the trees. "Would you take a walk with me?" She stared at him in surprise. "Yes, all right." He helped her to her feet, and they left the little clearing, bidding the Fae farewell as they linked their arms together and headed off into the trees. It was a long time the couple walked together without speaking, never far apart, but never quite touching as well. While in the beginning they had been snugly intertwined, Jessie seemed to get more and more nervous the farther they strayed from camp, so thoroughly baffling Kiera with the sudden change that they'd almost hiked a full mile before she reached out and caught his sleeve. "Should we stop for food and water, or is this present of yours close?" He scanned manically over the terrain, feeling caged and claustrophobic despite the endless expanse, before returning to the girl beside him and colouring with a blush. "No, here's fine." "For what?" She watched as he unclasped his cloak, letting it ripple to the ground behind him. The boots were next, kicking lightly into the grass. "You're not going to kill me, are you?" He levelled her with a choice look. "I'm not accusing you," she said quickly, lifting her hands. "But you hear stories like that sometimes. Girl follows boy into forest. Boy has a change of heart and strangles her to death. On her birthday." "I am not going to kill you," he said decisively, "no matter how the mood strikes. I actually just wanted to... There is this thing that I've been..." He let out a nervous breath, raking back his hair. "This would be so much easier if you were a shifter." Kiera's face went still with surprise. They never spoke of such things, though they were obvious enough. There were times he vanished into the forest, leaving his clothes behind. There were times when she heard a distant howl echoing off the trees. But shocking as those moments had been in the beginning, she was strangely accustomed to them now. There were some days when a part of her even forgot. "Oh," she said quietly, fiddling with her hands. After a few seconds, she chanced another look at him. "Would you like me to pretend?" His eyes flew up before he let out a burst of such loud laughter it must have carried all the way back through the trees. The tension vanished, and he closed the distance between them, taking her hands lightly in his own. A trace of a smile still lingered as he stared into her eyes. "There is a custom amongst my people, a custom that is known to every wolf in every pack. It's a kind of symbol, I guess, a surrendering between one person and another." Her pulse quickened instinctively, though she didn't understand. "You wish me to surrender to you? Again, on my birthday? Also, what does that mean?" "No," he said quietly, losing himself in her eyes. "Quite the other way around." With her still watching, he took a deep breath and removed the rest of his clothing, stripping down to the barest and most vulnerable, until there was nothing left to his body but glowing bronze skin. A flush crept into his cheeks, but he tried to steady himself, fingers trembling by his sides. "They call it the binding. I've never known why." A breeze picked up around them, stirring the tips of his hair. "But you called us a couple the other day, and every couple I've ever known has done it. My parents did it. I always wondered if one day I'd do it myself." By now, her pulse was racing at a speed that was probably unhealthy. His words had stacked atop each other, building the suspense and tension until she couldn't possibly imagine the scope and scale of what might be coming next. But as it turned out, the act itself was rather simple. With a final look, he shed his skin as well, disappearing in a blur of movement and colour until a chestnut, sleek wolf appeared in his place. It regarded her intently, staring with the exact same green eyes, before it walked quietly forward and pressed its nose to the ground at her feet. She drew in a quick breath, staring down upon it. She understood what he meant now when he called it a surrender, and she understood why it was called the binding, for after that day, neither one of them would ever quite be the same. It was the greatest gift one person could give another. It was a piece of his heart, offered freely, hers to keep. She had never felt anything like it. She would never feel anything like it again. Chapter 6. Kiera and Jessie took their time in the forest, thinking of several more presents they could give one another, before eventually wandering back through the trees. The binding had been relatively chaste compared to what happened next. The hours had crept along, and Kiera's cheeks were flushed and sore from laughing by the time they made it back into camp. "Back so soon?" Eden teased, barely glancing up from his arrows. It was a habit he no longer noticed, an anxious fluttering of fingers to pass the time. "I was about to search." Kiera merely blushed and turned her face into Jessie's shoulder, while the shifter glanced swiftly around the camp. "Evander isn't back yet." The Fae shook his head. His fingers moved faster. "So the day is not yet done," Kiera said casually, easing down beside him. "It is still my birthday, you'll remember, a near sacred day." Her fingers inched towards an arrow. He slapped down her hand. "I only mention this because I have a question for you, one I've long wanted to ask." Eden sighed quietly, but his lips curved with a smile. "Let's hear it then." She paused, like a diver preparing to jump. "How old are you?" She panicked the moment it left her lips, pairing it with an almost immediate, "I'm so sorry. Is it terribly inappropriate for me to ask?" He glanced towards her with a little smile. "Inappropriate?" "I just mean, I would never want to offend you." He laughed softly, returning to the arrows. He had grown so practiced and checked them so many times, he no longer needed to look, though he often did. His fingers moved so quickly, she could scarcely see them in the fading light. "You'd never want to offend me," he repeated under his breath. "I know for a fact that isn't true." But his eyes flicked up with a smile, catching the light. "Kiera, how old are you?" There was a pause. 17. 18 now." "Are you offended?" She blushed, then shook her head. "The only thing that could be inappropriate is your reaction," he continued abruptly, almost warily, as if he'd been bracing just as long for the inevitable question. "In the context of morality, these things tend to sound extreme." "Are you stalling, Eden?" He threw her a look. "I'm close to 900 years old." There was a beat of silence. Then, "What?" A host of birds went screeching into the sky as her voice whipped across the clearing, striking loud enough to make her own teeth rattle, though she could feel nothing but surprise. 900! She shrieked, unable to do anything but repeat it. If he'd said 90, it would have been enough. "But that's impossible! I mean, clearly not, but that's impossible!" He stiffened slightly, as though he'd been offended after all. "Why don't you think on it while I fetch some more wood?" She caught his sleeve as he made to stand, pulling him back down again. "Do you feel like it?" she asked eagerly. "What do you mean?" "Do you feel 900 years old?" He sighed again, throwing a glance at the heavens. "This is why I warned of a hyperbolic reaction." "Hyperbolic reaction," she scoffed, still eyeing him like parts might suddenly break. "You are older than most trees." She shook her head, unable to wrap her mind around it. "But you are in your teens, perhaps your 20s, aren't you? You and I, are we not technically aged the same?" He eyed her speculatively, as if he'd never considered the question. "Possibly. I suppose we are not dissimilar.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are, she argued against herself, losing all concept of a filter. We are about as dissimilar as two people can get. To start, I would never use a word like that on my own. He opened his mouth to speak again, but she beat him to it. Close to 900. You don't even bother counting anymore. She shook her head, incredulously, eyes widening to take up a ridiculous portion of her face. And why would you? By then, there was scarcely a need for the Fae to be part of the conversation. He was the subject, little more, and she was more than capable of playing both parts herself. What will you do when you reach 1,000? Is there a ceremony of some kind? He frowned thoughtfully at the arrows, before giving her a significant look. At that point, the people who know me best would customarily turn my life into a play. She couldn't tell if he was joking. Probably not. What's happened? Jessie asked conversationally, joining them. He'd just returned from the trees, heaving another log onto the fire. You look as though you'd seen a ghost. She scooted over quickly on the rocks to make room. You know what? There's a chance that I have. I just asked how old Eden was. Oh yes? How old? It's not really important, Eden tried to interject. He's ancient, she answered almost proudly. He's close to 900. Really? Jessie glanced at the Fae with a little smile. There was a chance they'd already had a similar conversation. Then his eyes danced with sudden curiosity. How old is Evander? Eden visibly stiffened, glancing with irritation at the shifter. He's about the same age as me. About? Kiera prompted eagerly. Give or take a decade. She leaned back with a long breath, as though she'd exhausted herself with the mere conversation. So we truly do seem like children to you, she murmured. How could we not? Eden regarded her a moment, then softened with a little smile. The Fae were entrusted with custodianship of this place. We were tasked with protecting. It is perhaps the reason we were granted immortality as well, he added, tendering as he looked upon her again. Your age, especially when contrasted to mine, it makes that protecting very easy to do. A gentle hush fell over the clearing, broken only by the soft fluttering and occasional crackle of the fire. The Fae had a way of doing things like that, seeing past the framework of such things to the sweet intention beneath. It may have been unique to all his people, or perhaps just to himself. The day's tasks were already finished, their bellies were sated, and the instruments they'd used had been properly stored and cleaned. There was little else to do but lose oneself in the hypnotic blaze of the fire. It was a long time before one of them finally broke the silence to speak. Where is he? Eden muttered under his breath, glancing for the 100th time around the shadowy woods. I was expecting him back long ago. Jessie followed his gaze, straightening a little upon the rock. I believe he was hunting. Eden nodded silently, but he did not look convinced. If someone had asked before, Kiera might have believed there wasn't much in the forest that could do harm to a vampire, but the world wasn't the same place it used to be, and seeing the worry on Eden's face, she wasn't so sure. Wouldn't you like us to look for him? Jessie asked softly. It was a kind offer, one that might have embarrassed the Fae if he'd been paying attention, but he nodded faintly, gathering the arrows and pushing to his feet. Perhaps we should. There was a crackle in the trees behind them. There, Kiera interjected soothingly. He is coming now. She should have known it was wrong the moment she said it. Why was she the one to have heard him? Why didn't one of the others hear it first? And why was she able to hear him? The vampire was perfectly silent. They could never hear him coming. The ferns parted, and a group of men suddenly stepped through the trees. They had approached with almost as much stealth, though she didn't see how that was possible. They were the biggest, meanest,
most heavily armored men she had ever seen. Not a vampire in sight. Carpathians. Kiera didn't know the word until someone told her later. Never in her life had she seen such a band of brutes, not even in the tavern, which was sometimes quite rough. They seemed to swell the very air around them, too big for their clothing, too big for their swords. Most of them seemed merely playthings, though some had been forged to size. There was one battle axe in particular that she couldn't fail to catch the eye, sharpened wickedly on both sides. And what of the others? She thought suddenly. Such things weren't made for them, surely, but taken from others, people they've slain. There were 9 of them, standing not in a group, but a loose line, as if they needed to take up more space. They had cut through the woods at a sudden angle, excited to see the smoke, but upon seeing the collection of people in front of them, it was impossible to hide their surprise. "Good evening," the one in the middle spoke first, pairing the harsh grate of his voice with a gleaming smile. "I hope we did not interrupt your party." Kiera stared blankly for a moment. Then her eyes drifted over to where the picnic blanket was still stretched upon the ground. The dishes had been cleaned, but the food they decided to leave for the animals. When her eyes rested upon the honeyed flowers, she felt suddenly faint. Eden had a singular focus, made even more pressing by the appearance of the men. "We are traveling with a vampire. Have you seen him?" At first, she was surprised he'd asked so plainly. Then she was not. It was a dangerous thing to risk angering a fae, and while these men might not be aware, it was also impossible to lie. "Are you really?" the Carpathian asked just as openly. "You?" He looked the fae slowly up and down. "That seems a rather unique arrangement. You must enlighten me." As he spoke, more Carpathians poured through the trees, like the silent overturning of glass. They strained the edges of the camp until it was no longer possible to see the forest behind them. She could feel the heat coming off their bodies, dirt and blood mixed with sweat. "Another time," Eden said curtly. Outnumbered or not, the man's pride would allow him to speak no different. That being said, he wasn't foolish. He had been counting, and he did not like where things had ended up. "Where are you headed?" "To the river countries," the man answered immediately, prompting a chortle of laughter from those behind him. "We're going to have a little fun." He paused indulgently until it was quiet, before continuing curiously. "What of yourselves? You are a long ways from anything." The fae ignored the question, staring intently across the fire. "You would travel in this forest?" It wasn't until he'd said it that Kiera realized it must be a particularly beloved wood. The fae gravitated towards places of serene, natural beauty, and she had never been anywhere lovelier. The man's lips twisted into a smirk. "The fair folk do not patrol it as they once did. They're in their settlements now, preparing for a brighter future. We are concerned with the present, finding simple pleasures where we can." His eyes strayed between them, lingering a moment on each one. Jesse was completely unarmed, without even the small knife he carried as a precaution. Eden was holding a fist of arrows, but his bow was leaning against the side of the tent. If he had not been so foolishly distracted, worrying after the vampire, he might have grabbed it in time. And Kiera? The man wanted a closer look. "Girl, bring us a drink." He planted his fists upon his hips, leaning backwards slightly as the men laughed behind him. "Is this any way for a hostess to treat her guests?" Strangely enough, it wasn't terribly different from commands she'd been given her entire life. Men liked giving commands. It was something she'd learned early on, and those commands were always loudest when they had an audience. But this man wanted something far more than a drink. "Do not speak to her," Jesse answered through gritted teeth. His hand drifted towards its side, though nothing was there. "If you and your men are thirsty, I suggest you go elsewhere." The Carpathian smiled and stepped forward as if he'd been hoping the shifter would say that exact thing. "Ah, but my men and I are tired as well. Long have we already travelled, and there is much farther still to go." His eyes glinted in the firelight. "What we really need is a bed." At that point, several things happened. Kiera reeled back as the man lunged forward. Jesse appeared in between. Weapon or not, he rammed into the Carpathian, forcing him back. He was caught himself in the process. Two men seized his arms before passing him back to their leader. A knife appeared, lodged beneath his throat. Just seconds had passed, but they had changed everything.
"No!"
Kiera gasped in horror, pulling against the grip that held her. The only reason she hadn't thrown herself straight back into the fray was that Eden had caught hold of her wrist. He pulled her slowly behind him, never breaking the Carpathian's gaze. "Let the boy go," he said softly, easing forward. "I am asking you." Jesse strained against the fingers holding him. The dagger lifted his chin. "Take her and leave," he hissed, unable to open his jaw. "You are faster than they are." "That won't be necessary," Eden murmured, taking a step closer. His eyes alighted not on the dagger, but the man. "That is a mistake. He moved in defense of the girl. It was not to quarrel." There was an edge of warning to his voice, but it was diplomatic all the same. This was not a fight he wanted, though a fight seemed to be coming. "I'm not sure if that matters," the man said lightly, digging around the tip of the blade with a grin. A few drops of blood peeked through the skin, spilling down his neck. "The boy attacked me." Eden stopped at the blood, but raised his eyebrow with the hint of a smile. "Do you wish to quarrel?" There was an uneasy stirring amongst the Carpathians, all 20 of them, though they were facing only one man. But the smile was a front. Kiera had seen it before. Eden was stalling. But stalling for what? The man considered him for a long time, long enough that if her blood hadn't been spiked with fear, Kiera would have seen it as a compliment. Twice, his eyes drifted down to those long fingers, an archer's fingers. His people had felt their wrath many times before. But the Fae's bow was paces behind him. The boy would be dead by then. "You are a long ways from anything," he murmured again, almost to himself. "You are burdened with mortals, and these woods alone." His own words seemed to convince him. He nodded their approval. "In light of present circumstances, I think we'll be taking that drink. It appears we've forgotten our manners." The vampire appeared out of nowhere, like a bolt from the sky. There were leaves in his dark hair, still fluttering skyward from the speed, but the rest of him was strangely motionless. He looked first, as always, to Eden. Then he turned those piercing eyes to the host of men before them. Kiera sucked in a quick breath, half thinking to see the ground scorched beneath his feet. "You were not deceiving." The rest of the Carpathians stopped their smiling. Even the man holding the dagger had the good sense to look afraid. "You are travelling with a vampire." But Eden was no longer listening. He was staring at the back of Evander's head with a feeling of such overwhelming relief. For a moment, he could not breathe. He recovered himself quickly, offering a tense greeting. "We have visitors, friends from Carpathia." Evander nodded slowly, his eyes finding each one. "I love Carpathians," he said softly, cocking his head with the ghost of a smile. "I love the sound they make when they fall." There was not a breath in the clearing. Even the nighttime birds had the good sense not to speak. The man tightened his grip upon the blade, making Essie arch backward into him. "Careful, vampire," he warned, weighing his options at the same time, "or I will split your friend from his head to his boots. I promise you, he will not look so pretty then." Evander's voice was smooth and cold as a winter stream. "Touch a hair on his head, and they will find you in pieces."
It was perhaps the most frightening thing about vampires. A race so utterly devoid of natural predators, they were not built with the concept of a bluff. The Carpathian clearly knew this. His men were angling for the trees, but those eternal eyes had already found each one of them. And the vampires were also not built to forgive. Eden took a step freely into the open, not towards the tent with all his weapons, but towards their visitors instead. They had brought enough weapons. Several of them were just his size. "Jesse, I wish you were not wearing shoes." The two men locked eyes for a split second. The calm before the storm. Then that storm was upon them. There was a sound like a blacksmith's wheel, as flesh ripped from flesh, and the cries that followed lost themselves in the night air. They were an emblem, the final burst of light, like the smoke an extinguished candle leaves behind. It would be remembered just briefly, then forgotten. Almost before anything else, Jesse had disappeared from the fight altogether, making the transformation mid-air as his body flipped backward, landing behind the Carpathian line. Whether it was what he'd intended, or merely the only angle he could jump without losing his neck, the others would never know. But Kiera suspected the former. The boy, as the others had so been distractedly referring to him, might have been a mere 20 years old, but he carried the pride of a wolf, and he was more than capable of fighting back. There was a sweet sting of metal as he disarmed the first man standing in front of him, and ran the second through with his blade. The third gave him little more challenge, lunging foolishly for a feigned parry and impaling himself in the process. And by the time the fourth had turned around, Jesse had already slipped right through that clanking armor, blood dripping from his blade. The others were engaging in an equally direct approach. Eden had never gone back for the bow, but he was still using the arrows. Like an animal that had sprouted sudden claws, he leapt upon anyone who tried to stop him, finding the weak points in their armor and silencing the first flickers of resistance with deadly, lightning-fast jabs. Whenever someone began to crowd him or venture too near, he kicked them back, imperious as ever, even when dealing those lethal blows. They would be patient. They would wait their turn. Evander was fighting beside him, never too close, but never too far. There was something just as compelling, but harder to trace. The vampire was simply there, and then he wasn't. No blurring spirals of motion, no shimmering arcs of light. He was death, working with light fingers. It was the moments he slowed down that were the most troubling, when he took his time. "Please!" There came a quailing cry as a man inched along the ground, staring up with a look of sheer terror as he retreated in slow motion from the vampire. While there was no way of knowing, it was the first time a Carpathian had ever said the word. His palm slipped on the slick grass, shaking with such visceral fear, the others could smell the stench. "No, please!" There was something strange about saying please to a vampire, like shouting at the clouds to stop the rain. Still the man tried, racked with dry, choking sobs that brought no air. Evander stared down without expression, a cold god amongst the trees. Instead of snapping the man's neck, as he'd done with so many others, instead of simply crushing his skull as he walked by, the vampire knelt down instead, reaching towards him. There was a soft intake of breath as he kept reaching, and kept reaching still further after that. His fingers vanished, then came up bright red, an unnatural color, different from all the rest. He leaned forward with a whisper, lips touching the man's ear. "Pick better friends." So many there had been when the friends had started, and so few there were just a few moments in. There had been a few injuries, sacrifices of their own blood, but considering the size and admitted skill that battled against them, there was no shame in any one. Jesse got a fist to the jaw that sent him stumbling into the shadows, seeing stars. Eden got a slice across the back of the shoulder,
a warm sting, and the air was scented with blood. There had been retribution then, but not by the Fae's own hand. No sooner had the vampire's head snapped up across the clearing than the man in question was lying in 4 separate pieces, each one pointing with odd symmetry in a different direction, like a gruesome compass that couldn't make up its mind. Not one of them had made it to Kiera. Not a single one. She had dutifully done what she always did, what they always told her to do. She had run a safe distance and proceeded to hide. How she hated herself in those moments, when her mortality stung worse than an adder's bite, and she had to watch from a distance as the ones she loved battled to stay alive. Sometimes she found herself wanting to call out and warn them. On countless different occasions, she'd sprung to her feet to join them, desperate to throw herself into the fight. But almost as if by uncanny intuition, one of them would always glance her way. Her cheeks would flush, and she would sink back into the shadows, remembering her place the way a child was taught to remember its name. I am a mortal. I have no special powers. I am unskilled with a blade. The adrenaline would fade, the shame would set in, and the inevitable reality would tighten her chest. She would not be a help but a hindrance. The greatest thing she could do was hide. There you are! She whipped around with a gasp, staring at the gruesome man who demanded she bring him a drink just a few minutes before. His shoulder was bleeding, and he was missing a large chunk of hair. But aside from that, he seemed to have deserted the fight a great deal sooner than his men. Brave man, hiding behind his friends. Her chest tightened. Brave like you. She threw a quick glance over her shoulder, but the others were engaged in fights of their own, and not a single one of them looked her way. She had chosen her spot well, deep in the ravine that ran alongside the camp. Her body was tilted almost straight vertical, allowing her a glimpse of what was happening, while having the option to scramble away in case she was seen. At least that had been the idea. There is time for you to run, she whispered. They might not find you. It was the only leverage she had, and he probably should have taken it. Their distraction would not last forever. They would be coming for her before long. But Carpathians were not built for such mercies. They were built to make people scream. I will leave, he conceded, bleeding freely down the face. But I'm taking you with me. She cried out when he grabbed for her, flipping onto her stomach and falling against the slope. Her fingers scrambled in the bramble for anything she might use to help, but came away twisted in vines and smeared with blood. There was a great pressure behind her, pushing her so deep into the mountain it felt as though she couldn't breathe. Her lungs ached for air, heaving in silence, while his fingers twisted against her scalp, coming up with a fist of hair. There was a sharp tug, and the ground vanished beneath her. Her hands clawed desperately at the open air, grabbing hold of anything they could find. It was her birthday flowers, the ones from Evander. Without stopping to think, she twisted around and shoved them into the Carpathian's face, holding them steady as he drew in a great breath of surprise. When his mouth opened, she pushed them inside, screaming like a feral creature, cramming them with every bit of force she could muster, until, all at once, she realized the man was no longer alive. She let out a final shriek and jerked backward, watching in belated terror as he slid down the front of her dress and fell with a splat in the mud. There was a dull impact, then everything went perfectly still. So much movement a second before, then perfectly, incomprehensibly still. That was when she heard a sound and looked at the ridge above her. A small group of people had gathered, 3 sets of dirty faces, 3 pairs of glittering eyes. I don't understand, Evander said in confusion. Did he choke? Jesse shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. The flowers you gathered, they're poisonous. Evander shot him a look of surprise, then hopped down into the clearing. He ignored Kiera completely and knelt down beside the corpse, its mouth still twisted open in a silent scream. Without a moment's pause, he reached inside and pulled out a crumpled petal, running it between his fingers. A second later, his face lightened with a sudden memory. "You know what? I'm pretty sure I knew that." Chapter 7. 3 days went past, then 3 more after that. The friends made their way steadily up the range of mountains, making only brief stops, walking until the moon had already risen high above them. Some were trying hard to forget the bodies they'd left behind them. Some had not remembered the past the first slopes. It was on a rare evening they'd stopped before dusk that Kiera was sitting by herself a short ways from the others, arms curled around her knees, a faint frown upon her face. The sky was full of meadowlarks, up later than usual, and calling loud throughout the trees. It was a lilting song, lovely. It irritated her. Everything irritated her. She was irritated by the sky itself.
"She is quiet,"
Eden whispered loudly, stoking the embers of a wilting fire. "It is never a good sign when she's quiet." The 3 men were seated together, their backs against a smooth crop of rocks stretching above them onto a grassy plain. The journey had been full of contradictions like that. Trees one moment and fields the next. The seams were not so woven together, but jagged and extreme. She got up in one swift movement, pacing towards them. "I need you to teach me how to fight." She aimed it not at either of the others, but directly at the Fae, the one from whom she'd first extracted a promise, the one she thought would be most likely to help. His eyes fixed upon her in surprise, bright with curiosity. "Of course, I have already agreed to that." He pushed halfway to his feet. "It has been a while since our last lesson." "Not placate me. Teach me." Those feelings of helplessness swelled inside her once again. It had taken her 3 days of walking to realize there was anger at the core. This would not be a thing that would come to define her. She would not be safeguarded and scripted onto the side. She would stand beside her brothers. They would take up arms together. "Teach me with the same frustration you might feel if all your life you'd been expected to sit on the edge of a fight." She shook her head, bouncing in place. "I'm not doing that anymore." The men stared up in unison, their expressions frozen. After a few seconds, Jesse cleared his throat. "We asked you only because—" "You asked me because only I don't know any better." "You killed someone." "I killed him with flowers. Do not get me started." Eden nodded slowly, solemn and sincere. "I understand. I agree with you. But do not discount the things you've already done," he continued gently. "You have come far, Kiera. In a short time you have learned much. You have given me basic skills. I'll not deny that. But in the end, those skills amount to the same courage as a deserter, ready to sacrifice his friends." Her voice rose in timbre. "You have been easy on me. You have listened to my whining, and I will never be prepared." The Fae flinched, then froze very still. "It was never my intention." "The best of intentions kill women in the forest," she said briskly. "I need better than intentions now. Please, Eden, get to your feet." The Fae got to his feet. The others did as well, following in silence up the rocks and to the grassy plain above. The evening sun cast slanting shadows across the lawn, like pointed fingers reaching towards them. It was not the best time to be sparring. Kiera knew this. The shading was at its most difficult, and it was hard to see the Fae's attacks coming in the best of light. So far, their training had been in stolen moments of broad daylight, with everything illuminated to its best. But that evening, she didn't care. The Carpathians had come at dusk. The light had been the same. We shall pick up where we left off, the Fae said quietly, looking almost uneasy to have an audience. An actual fight. No scripted movements, but slow, Kiera. Keep it slow. She nodded at top speeds, forgetting the concept of slow. When the Fae inclined his head, she flew towards him, taking advantage of his moment of surprise to kick him straight in the chest. He fell back a step, letting out a sharp breath, but he didn't stop her. At least, he didn't make her stop. He simply adjusted his own movements so they suited her pace, battling across the field at whatever speed she might like. Remember your arm, he instructed, ducking as she curled it towards his face. Good. Now in this position, he flipped her lightly onto the grass, changing mid-thought. Don't do that. Never do that. It's a surefire way to get yourself, what, applauded? She picked herself up with a glare, dusting off the grass. I'm fairly sure that's from a waltz, Eden. This isn't teaching me. He threw up his hands. Then what would you have me do? How did you learn to fight? She countered, looking from one to the other. You grew up fighting. Your whole lives, you've been fighting, while I've been serving you drinks. It is time I got my share of the fighting, and that's not going to happen with you treating me like a doll. She struck him across the face. Hard. Now me. He went still as a deer. What? Hit me. She gestured to her face, teeth grinding together. Hit me the same way it would actually happen. Hit me the same way you would do to anyone else. Jessie stepped forward, tensed to the brink. Kiera, you can't ask him to do that. This is why I didn't come to you for help. Do it, Eden. No more coddling. No more acting like we're just playing pretend. I'm sure it hurt the first time someone hit you too. Now hit me. His hand lifted slowly, then lowered back to his side. You can't ask me to do that, he said softly. A hard silence stretched between them, louder than anything that had come before. Beneath that endless sky, there seemed no hiding from it, no escaping it. It threatened to consume them all. Evander lifted his hand. I can do it. 3 people turned in silence. 3 people spoke at the same time. What? 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 The vampire shrugged casually, hands in his pockets. I will teach the girl. And the cat would play games with the bird, and the fox and the lamb would curl up together, intuiting bedtime stories and falling asleep, so the vampire would give sparring lessons to a mortal. This is a joke, Eden said flatly, no hint of a question. It is not, Evander countered. I have been fighting for just as long as you, perhaps even longer. Why could I not instruct her? The Fae misspoke, Jessie interrupted sharply. That is a bad joke, Evander. The kind of joke you should not be making again. The vampire's lips twitched in a faint smile. Do you think me lacking in control? The Fae blushed and turned his eyes. Kiera has nothing to fear. I will check my strength. Her eyes flashed up when he said her name. Usually she was the girl, or the mortal, or on a particular bad day, the one with red hair. Seldom was she Kiera. But she was that day. You will not eat me? She asked shrewdly. He lifted his hand in such a boyish gesture, it took everything in her not to laugh. Their eyes met, and all at once, she was abruptly convinced the vampire would be the person she'd always ask. Then let us begin. He flew towards her without another word, slowing down just enough that she was able to see it coming, which, in hindsight, was much worse. By the time she'd lifted her hands, she was sprawling across the grass, striking the ground with enough force all the air rushed from her chest. Eden winced in silence. Jessie simply closed his eyes. I cannot watch this, he muttered. You would have laughed if it was Eden, she answered, picking herself back up. A knot swelled on the back of her hand, and her mouth tasted bloody. You'd laugh if it was yourself. Which is baffling. The world might have been spinning, but she put on a good facade. As soon as it tilted back on its axis, she paced calmly forward, lifting both her hands. How can I stop something like that? If someone just charges toward me, how can I avoid ending up on my back? Evander lifted his eyebrows, almost mocking. You need to understand that I'm not going to stop. Right. The next time he came at her, she flew even farther, though she did have a slightly better idea what to expect. From that point on, it became clear that Evander didn't mean to give her a lesson. He meant simply to fight her, a lesson in itself. Instead of a patient lecture and repetition, endless repetition, of the others, he moved at whim from one moment to the next, from one attack to the next. It seems to be not so much about the fight, but merely understanding the mindset of a fighter. At the core of Evander, there was nothing but confidence. He knew his body. He knew what it could do. When facing down an opponent, he knew exactly what to expect. It was perhaps the reason vampires were so choosy when picking fights. That unholy strength and fantastical speed were grounded by a simple pragmatism, a dark anchor to steady the lightning flashes of those hands. It was a valuable lesson, though their standards were different. At the core of Kiera, there was nothing but sheer will. It was something she had not known until the question was put upon her, a fundamental piece of humanity that had been unable to ever thrive. It was what kept the fight going, kept her getting off the ground. It was what kept her driving at her opponent, searching for new ways to attack him, waiting for the inevitable moment, no matter how far away, that she finally got through. That moment will not be today. There was a high-pitched shriek as he struck her across the face, using precisely the same amount of force as when she'd hit Eden. The shadows blossomed and stars burst behind her eyes. It took a few seconds before she was fully able to come back. Now me, he commanded. Her hand flew up of its own accord, fueled with a dizzied rage she'd never known. But it stopped just as fast, struck midair like a sudden wind had risen against it, making her unable to fully connect. The dissonance was overwhelming. She could not be damaging. She could not be rude. The impulse swelled inside her, but it was like trying to flex a muscle that wasn't there. She struck him anyway, a sharp slap across the face, one meant to dissuade. His hair flew back, but his face was steady. When those dark locks had settled, he tilted his head with a little smile. That is not how I struck you. Her cheeks flamed, and she nodded quickly. I know. Sorry, Do you think I would ever apologize for something like that? Do you think people often apologize when doing such things? He looked at her intently. There is a difference between mercy and apology. One is used at your discretion. There is no place for the other here. She nodded again, but kept her eyes on the ground, still flushed with a growing sense of shame she could not begin to unravel. A kind of weight had descended upon her shoulders, making her feel heavy and exposed, as if her body was taking up too much space beneath the endless sky. This was a mistake. This is indulgent. I should not have asked for this. He regarded her intently another moment, almost as if he was listening along. Then he slipped his fingers beneath her chin and lifted it until the two were eye to eye. Until you make it real, it never will be. He spoke softly, but there was a thrill in those quiet words, as thrilling as the vampire himself. If you want something, you must take it. She drew in a breath and struck him, actually struck him. There was a crack like she had never heard, and she yanked her hand back almost immediately, fingers stinging like a burn. He considered. That was not very good. Her arm dropped to her side. He lifted it with a coaxing smile. It will get better. Try again. She swung at him again, but found herself stymied by a new impulse, holding back even as she was swinging, her fingers still throbbing, forbidding herself to wield such force.
I don't wish to hurt you.
You don't wish to fail.
No, she insisted. I don't wish to hurt you.
Time stilled between them as she suddenly realized this was the crux. Not just the pain, but the risk to both sides. There was a cost to such exposure. There was a fear in removing the net. You will not hurt me, he answered, quiet but firm. I am not the kind to bend or waver. I am not the kind to break. Let us see the best you have to offer. His eyes flicked up for a split second, drifting somewhere over her shoulder. Test that strength out on me. She threw herself upon him a second later, battering with her fists and grasping with all her might, abandoning every trace of caution and wisdom and restraint. There was pain, such unending, unsupervised pain, she thought she might never feel whole again. But there was such freedom there as well, as if every other moment had been stunted, as if some invisible pressure had been lifted, and for the first time in her life, she was able to use her lungs properly, to take a deep, filling breath. That's better, Evander called, rising up to meet her. Again! The shifter was cheering. Soon he would join in, but he was the only one. The Fae had gone very still at the edge of the clearing, freezing as if the vampire's words had been meant for his ears alone. He stood the rest of the lesson in silence, watching them go through the paces, watching the devastating and delicate way the vampire handled his friends. When it was finished, he paced into the trees, and didn't return for a long time.